thank you all for your patience and joining us here, and thanks very much for coming along to the Scotland specific event. Hopefully you all managed to listen to Becky's overview of the whole report, which is always fantastic. She's got such a wealth of knowledge, clearly, from being the author herself. But this is really an opportunity for us to move on from the UK-wide overview to look at the Scottish-specific one from the 280 respondents from Scotland, to give us a better perspective of our Scottish families' experiences. So, despite Scottish families having a higher average response in identifying as facing challenges, but managing or facing severe challenges, and as you can see from the responses here, we were at 76% in comparison to the UK-wide 72%. A high number of 82% respondents would encourage others to consider adoption, and 81% felt confident and optimistic about their children's future. And I think this tells us a lot about the resilience of Scottish adoptive families and their commitment to supporting their children through the challenges. The lack of national guidance and provision of centralised support in comparison to other UK countries contributed to Scottish national policies as being assessed as poor or fair, really across the board. And we're committed to working with Scottish Government as Adoption UK and Scotland to make sure that we're sharing views from families and adopted individuals, along with learning from our own service delivery, to improve this, and with it the experience of adopted families in Scotland. It's concerning to read that Scottish families were the least likely in the UK to be offered enhanced therapeutic support when they were approaching their agency for health difficulties. 58% of respondents from Scotland had contacted their agency for support in 2020, but only 8% of those have received an assessment of support needs, and of this number, only 1 in 5 of the families received enhanced support. Anecdotally, we regularly hear from families about the lack of therapeutic support available when they need it, and the Barometer report really has just confirmed this, with comments from families reporting that they feel their agency has limited resources and specialist knowledge to provide the help needed. Just over a quarter of all families in Scotland that said they'd received the support from their agency during 2020 described the support that they had received as universal. And as you can see, universal support services are acknowledged to be support groups, general training or advice, or even just signposting to other agencies. The remaining group who were able to access enhanced support included families who were referred into Adoption UK's Test of Scotland programme, as well as life story work, art and play therapies, counselling and short break. But this group represented 13% of all adoptive families in Scotland, a figure that we see as not good enough when compared to the reported level of need. Relationships with the professionals working with the families are reported to be very positive, with 76% of Scottish respondents describing their social worker as being knowledgeable and understanding. And while this is valuable and good relationships are necessary for families, it's not a compensation for lack of wider services or bespoke adoption support. Where these external specialist services were accessed by families, recipients were extremely positive, as you can see from some of the comments that we've got up there on the slides. And they really talked about a very positive impact on their families. And it's really important that we acknowledge and recognise that families who aren't given the same opportunities are missing out on this impact. But at the moment in Scotland, the Promise has given us a real opportunity to give the chances to more families and provide that holistic and intensive family support to all families that need it. The report also tells us that families in Scotland are not accessing the Care Experience Children and Young Persons Fund as much as they should be for their children's education. While more knew of it in 2020 in comparison to 2018, with quite a significant increase from 18% to 35%, there were still only 16% who'd actually discussed it on behalf of their child with their children's school. And we see it as vital that going forward, schools and families are able to work more effectively together to improve educational settings and understanding of adopted children's needs. In particular, the understanding of the impact of early trauma and on the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which disproportionately affects care experienced young people. We were particularly pleased to have the focus of this year's report on adoptees' experience, and even more so to have 2 adopted adults join us for today's panel to discuss these further. But before I go on to introduce our panel of experts by experience, I'm delighted to be able to share a recording of the Minister of Children and Young People, Clare Haughey, and her response to our report. Unfortunately, she was unable to attend in person today, but she has shared her response via video link in her absence, and we're going to play that now. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to take part in the launch of the latest Adoption UK Adoption Barometer report. It's a valuable opportunity to listen to the voices of those using Scotland's adoption services, to find out what is working well and what we need to look to improve. I would like to thank Adoption UK Scotland for providing this welcome source of evidence, and more generally for the excellent services they provide to the adoption sector in Scotland. I was pleased to read in the report that 82% of respondents from Scotland would encourage others to consider adoption, and 81% felt optimistic about their family's future. However, the report raises serious issues about access to mental health services and adoption support services. Adoptive families across Scotland are providing the love and security that children deserve, and it's important that they receive the support they need when they need it most. Our legislation clearly sets out the requirements for local authorities to provide any adoption support that adoptive families need, but we're hearing from reports such as this that in reality more support needs to be provided. Adoption UK Scotland Director Fiona Aitken has said that the promised report of the Independent Care Review and COVID recovery provide for a real opportunity to improve services for our most vulnerable children, and I completely agree. The promise made it clear that adoption has an important role in providing permanent, loving, nurturing homes, and sets out that an adoption placement should not be the conclusion of the support offered to adoptive families. The promise highlights the importance of family support. The Collective Leadership Group provided a vision and blueprint with recommendations for holistic family support in Scotland, and this has received widespread support. We want to ensure that every family that needs support gets the right support at the right time for as long as it's needed. Through the Family Support Delivery Group, we are working in partnership with our partners in the third sector, statutory services and across government to deliver this vision. The government is fully committed to keeping the promise to Scotland's children and young people. The Change programme, which the Promise Scotland published on Friday, has provided a clear articulation of what needs to happen over the next 12 months to keep the promise. The barometer references the excellent work of Adoption UK's TESA programme. This is the type of programme which is in keeping with the principles and recommendations of the promise. I've asked my officials to meet with Adoption UK Scotland to explore the role TESA can continue to play in supporting adoptive families in Scotland. Mental health is an absolute priority for the Scottish Government, and that's why we've set out in our Mental Health Transition and Recovery programme, published on the 8th of October, our plans to prioritise our ongoing work to improve specialist CAM services, address long waiting times and clear waiting list backlogs. In addition, we continue to prioritise support for children and young people's mental health and wellbeing in schools and in education through actions such as the Mental Health in Schools Working Group, which is developing and delivering new mental health training and learning resources, and the Counselling in Schools commitment. The report also highlighted the need for additional support for many adopted children in education. We introduced the Care Experience Children and Young People's Grant in 2018-19, as we recognise care experience people need this additional support. Over £33 million was made available during the last parliamentary term, with over £11.5 million being provided to local authorities over 2021-22 academic year. Children and young people and their families, and help them to engage with better education. I would like to finish by reiterating my thanks to Adoption UK Scotland for this report. In my new role as Minister for Children and Young People, I look forward to working with you and others to continue to make improvements to adoption services in Scotland.
And we're grateful to the Minister for sharing her response to the report for this event. Obviously, it's unfortunate she wasn't able to be here in person and respond to any question and answers, but it is heartening to hear her pledge for further discussions about how we can improve experiences and the fact that she is keen to use the promise as an opportunity to do so. I'd like to go on to introduce our panel of experts by experience now, and we're really pleased to be joined today by Carol, Gillian, Derek and Maggie, who have a combination of personal and professional experience in adoption. So I'm going to go first. I'm going to go around and ask everybody to give a wee introduction of themselves, and I'll start with Carol, please.
Hi everyone, my name's Carol. So I am an adopted adult, and I'm also an adult that's living with FASD. I work within the education system as a guidance advisor at college level, so we deal with a lot of 16 to 25-year-olds who are care experienced, but I am also very much involved with Adoption UK and the FASD Hub Scotland as even volunteer, and just started as a community engagement lead for the Poor Honest project. So this is really, really close to my heart, and it is great to see so much groundwork being done, and looking forward to the future and what we can do to support the children and young people that we work with.
Thank you, Carol. Julian, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Fiona. My name is Julian Thompson. I am a law student at the University of Dundee, and I have been leading the support group for adopted adults with Adoption UK, and I've just recently been recruited into the role of support worker for the Promise project alongside Carol, and I've not met Carol, so it's lovely to meet Carol today. And I've worked with Adoption UK in a number of capacities to really bring the voice of adoptees into the way that we do things, both within society and within Adoption UK, and it's wonderful to be here today and to hear that Adoption UK is listening to the voice of adoptees.
Thanks, Julian. Derek, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm an adoptive parent, and we have two boys. One who came to us when he was about 3.5, and the other one was 15 months. And they were adopted from England, which slightly complicates the pictures in terms of the early experience and the later experience. They're coming up for this year being 19 and 21. And the older boy spent some time with Clare's family before going into foster care, and the youngest was taken into care directly from birth. And so the older boy's sort of developmental delay was clearer at the outset and was documented, but with the younger one there was no significant concerns at that point in time. But obviously, as time's gone on until now, sort of young adults, then over that time the problems that they faced have become increasingly clear.
Thank you. Thanks, Derek, and thanks for joining us today to give the adoptive parents' perspective of particularly older young people, which is the focus of today's discussion. I'd like now to introduce Maggie, who is going to give us a bit of an overview of the field of adoption and care in Scotland and the landscape of adoption. And I was just hoping that she might be able to give some commentary on how representative the report results are from her experience.
Yeah, hi, I'm Maggie. I'm a researcher based at the Adoption Fostering Alliance Scotland and also at the University of Stirling. And my personal connection to adoption is that I grew up with an adopted younger sister.
Maggie, could you give us a bit of an overview in respect of the different studies that you're currently involved with, and what overview of?
Yeah, so I was going to talk, in reading the findings from the Adoption Barometer report, I suppose I was thinking in particular about three pieces of research. One is the Permanently Progressing study, which is a national study of permanence for children in Scotland. It's a longitudinal study, so it's following up all children who became looked after in Scotland in the year 2012 to 2013, if they were aged 5 or younger, so that kind of younger end of the kind of full group of children who've become looked after. And we're just entering the second phase of that study. It started in 2015, so we published a whole set of reports from the first 4 years, and we're just entering the second 4 years of that study. It's led by Helen Wincup at the University of Stirling, and it involves University of Stirling, University of Lancaster, and ourselves at AUK Scotland. The second piece of research I was thinking about in relation to this is a piece of work called Mapping Adoption Support. So it was carried out about 2.5, 3 years ago in Scotland, and it was ourselves at AUK Scotland with Adoption UK. So Ali's here somewhere. Ali was involved in helping us with that study. But we contacted all local authorities and voluntary adoption agencies and third sector organisations that are offering some form of adoption support in Scotland, and produced a sort of map of what's available or what was available at that point in Scotland. But we also had responses from 74 adoptive parents across Scotland. And I suppose I was thinking about their responses in relation to this more recent data from adoptive parents and adopted young people and adults in Scotland. And then the third is an evaluation that's currently underway led by Chris Jones at Strathclyde of the TESA service that you mentioned, Fiona. And the pilot, which is just nearing completion, is focused on families in Wales and Scotland. So I was going to talk just very briefly about some of the things that are emerging from that study. There'll be sort of more to come from that study once the pilot report is published soon. But I suppose thinking about the barometer report, one of the real strengths of this report for me is that it's a Four Nations report, and that it's asking the same questions of people in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's quite rare. So that's one of its real values to me, is being able to kind of see how people in those different countries, in some ways we're very similar when you look at us from an international perspective, but there's lots of differences that I think come through really clearly, not just in this report, but in the previous reports of the Adoption Barometer as well.
So in respect of particularly the mapping of support services, Maggie, obviously what we're hearing is that people are really struggling to receive the services that they need from their adoption agencies. Does that tally with what you found 3 years ago when you were speaking directly with agencies and families?
Yeah, I think one of the things that came through really strongly was just the variation across different parts of Scotland and what people were able to access. I think the second part in that that's really important is not just people being able to access those kind of services, but being able to access them at the time when it's needed and not at the time where things have reached a real crisis point. Because I think one of the things that's come through in this report, and has certainly come through in other reports, is that sometimes families need that support much earlier, and maybe some of the really difficult aspects of things they're struggling with might not have needed to be quite as difficult as they were if support had been available earlier. And also it needing to be the right support. So really needing to kind of understand what it is that individual child and young person and their adoptive family needs, because there's a whole kind of range of different types of support out there, but it's finding what will kind of work for that child and young person and the adopters at the time. So yeah, and I think there's some things in this that I was thinking, unfortunately they're not new findings, but it's really important that we keep talking about them, and particularly that point about kind of access to mental health and therapeutic support. I think we do need to keep raising that, and I think we all hope that what the promise offers is a real opportunity to not only keep raising that, but to kind of make changes in relation to some of these findings.
Perfect, thank you. I've got a few questions that I'm just going to go around each of the individual speakers and ask them to comment on in respect to some of the main themes that were highlighted in the report. So firstly, that access to mental health support has been one of the strongest features, with numbers such as 51% of 16 to 25-year-olds involved in mental health services in 2020, but strikingly over 2/3 of respondents said that they weren't able to access the supports that they actually needed. Julian, I wonder if you would feel able to comment on your personal experience of this as an adopted adult.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks Fiona. So my experience of accessing mental health support as a younger person was relatively poor in comparison to what it is now, or what it is for me as an adult. A lot of the confusion and the questions around identity and actually knowing that something was wrong and yet not quite being able to put my finger on it meant that a lot of services were unable to help me. I remember when I was 13, 14 going for an assessment at psychology and being diagnosed with mild depression. At the age of 27, I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. A couple of years before that, I was put on antidepressants. So really what the question that raises in my mind is, why wasn't that picked up? And why did it take for me to reach crisis point for services to respond to my needs, which were quite obvious back when I was 13, 14.
Thank you for sharing that. Is there something that you think could have been done differently?
I do, but I'm slightly biased, Fiona. So for me, I often say, a childhood adversity is so obvious that childhood adversity will lead to adversity in adulthood. To me, that's always been obvious, and I think there was a missed opportunity because I think it's really obvious that children who've experienced trauma will struggle. But I think as a society, I think we're at a turning point now. But I think back in the early sort of 2000s, late 90s, we didn't necessarily know what we know today, and actually to have the conversation about child abuse, childhood trauma was maybe seen as a bit more edgy than it is today. So I think there was a missed opportunity to be courageous. And I think we need to start being a lot more courageous and brave in the way that we respond to these issues now.
I think you just made an excellent point there. Now that we know, we shouldn't be doing nothing about it. Carol, I wonder if you can comment a little bit about both your personal experience and also your work with other care experienced young people. And is this something that is a real struggle for the majority of people?
Yeah, so for me, the percentage only being 51 was a real shock to me, to be honest. Working as a guidance advisor in college and being frontline support for students and hearing about how much difficulties they're having, the impact on their mental health. So that was quite staggering for me, but also speaking to students as well and young people, we know that it's this mentality where COVID-19 was happening and they didn't want to bother anybody, so they didn't want to access or ask for help because they didn't want to be a burden on anybody. They're all dealing with feelings of isolation and being on their own and processing, those positive relationships, we weren't able to maintain them, during COVID and stuff for me. So I think that might be a reason why the figure is not as representative as it should be. But that's just from my own personal experience within the work. But again, it's like we have free counselling and stuff that we offer to students that isn't being picked up on because they think somebody else is in a worse off position and they deserve to have that place better than them. It's this it's not like, I think people just they feel like they've been a burden their whole life a lot of the time, and it's really sad to hear that. And I know myself, I used to be like that when I was younger. I didn't want to bother anybody. Everybody had enough on their plate without having to deal with my problems, sort of thing. And I think it's time that we start normalising accessing support and calling it shared strength, because at the end of the day, we're all really resilient individuals, and bringing voices to the table, which we promise we'll do, is just going to be fantastic, and we can act on that as soon as possible.
Well, that's great, thank you. Just want to talk a wee bit more about support then. The report identifies that in Scotland, adoptive parents' experience of accessing support is really tricky, with only 41% of those who identified as experiencing significant need being offered enhanced support. Maggie, I just wonder if you could tell us a wee bit more. You've spoken a bit about the landscape of adoption support services, but I wonder if you could talk a wee bit more about the impact of what good adoption support can have on a family.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects to that. I think nearly every study that I've been involved in, that's been really evident that where people get support that works for them, and sometimes it's not always the first source of support that they try, and I think we need to kind of anticipate that and think that sometimes you might need to try a couple of different things before before a child or young person or a family sort of clicks into the support that's right for them, but that it can make a huge difference. And I've done quite a lot of interviews with adopted adults in their sort of 40s and 50s, and I think one of the things that really stood out for me in the report is the importance of thinking long term, and that bit about kind of extending support into young adulthood, I think is really important, because from talking to adopted adults in sort of middle age, I think one of the things that really struck me is it can feel quite scary, I suppose, to think about adoption and the really long-term implications of this. But there's also a lot of hope in that, because there's people that have talked about how things have continued to change for them kind of across the lifespan, and each sort of new stage of life that they enter, or if new information emerges sometimes, or if relationships shift, there's lots of kind of opportunities within that. And we certainly shouldn't expect that the story's over when children and young people are 16 or 18. And even 26 to me still feels like there's a lot of the story to go. But I think it's an improvement to think about young people's kind of journeys into early adulthood.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that came through really strongly in the report, and in particular, it's fed into one of our recommendations, which is that we shouldn't be seeing there being a cut-off in terms of support, but absolutely not before at least the age of 26, which is what applies to all of our care experienced children in Scotland at the moment. Derek, I wonder, could you tell me a wee bit about your family's personal experience of access and support, and in particular, if peer support was something that you found beneficial?
Okay,
or
so
lacking?
to start with, we've taken to describing ourselves as being like frogs in boiling water, and in that it's taken until we're well poached before we've realised that we're in a crisis fund, because the history with both the boys has been one of problems being evident, but them being dealt with in very isolated and disconnected ways. So you might get a bit of input here, a bit of input there, but no real sense of anticipation of, well, these issues aren't going to go away. And in fact, they're going to get worse as they approach the late teens and early adulthood, which is proven to be the case. So they both had the typical 10-week inputs from CAMS when they were younger teenagers. And then as things have become really difficult with the youngest, we made a referral to CAMS, but because they wouldn't visit him in school, required him to go into the clinic and he wouldn't go, so that referral went nowhere. And then more recently, after a series of exclusions from school and other serious problems, again, referral back to CAMS, only to be told that, well, the waiting list is so long that will be in adult services before he gets to be seen. So then he had to sit on a CAMS waiting list until he turned 18, and then he was referred to adult mental health services, and then had another wait before getting seen there, having initially been rejected by adult mental health services, and finally having got a diagnosis of ADHD for him. And similarly with the older one, he has some problems around eating, but the difficulty we have there, again, these issues started in school and seen as a physical problem, not seen in terms of something that might need further investigation around mental health issues. Having got to adult services, now in the position where his IQ is not low enough to be seen by learning disability services. Adult mental health services have rejected a referral, and the eating disorder clinic, which is part of the adult mental health services, they say, can you go back to your GP and get them to refer back to adult mental health services? So there's a long history of disjointed provision of services, dealing with issues in an isolated manner, not anticipating what might come about, and then trying to access those services, all very difficult. And we have to work quite hard not to continually beat ourselves up and say, why didn't we recognise this at the point and anticipate all these needs? And certainly our experience of the GERFEC process was that it felt like a lot of box ticking, going through the process. We'd have these meetings so every so often, but there was no holistic overview. And it took us a long time, with us being essentially the boys' care managers and trying to organise services and get help for them, before we finally got a local authority social worker involved to just try and help us to pull all these different strands together and negotiate with services on our behalf, because then you have the usual problems of, oh, well, once you reach 18, oh, well, we're adults now, we can't talk to you, we have to talk to them. And then you have to go through a whole negotiation process of getting permission for them to talk to us. So we're really disconnected and disjointed services. That's been a struggle and continues to be a struggle. And again, not really having that help to pull things together has made things incredibly difficult. So the transition difficulty is increased, but then there wasn't really any help or anticipation in managing those, particularly as they left school.
So it sounds like you were lacking that initial acknowledgement of need for support. So the early intervention opportunity was then lost, and there was a lack of that holistic approach to joining things together, which has obviously had a very negative impact on your boys' transition into adult services. Gillian and Carol, I just wondered if I could ask you a little bit about your experience or your thoughts on how important peer support is for adopted young people.
Carol, would you like to go first?
Yeah, okay. So I think peer support is really, really important. You know, it's like yourself, you'd rather, you know, confide in a friend or someone that had been there, bought the t-shirt sort of thing. And I think that's why it's really good when the barometer highlighted about the importance of lived experience within organisations, because I think when you can relate to someone a lot better, you're more likely for the barriers to come down. We know that building positive relationships can take a long, long, long time. You know, especially if an individual's coming along, and we see it all the time, and I know I've done it myself, when you are introduced to somebody that's there trying to get information or trying to support you, and you're just like, here's another person getting paid to ask me what my thoughts are. So it's making sure that we can put, you know, peer support in place for young people. And I think for me, the Promise project's a really, really good opportunity for us to do that, with a view that we can build all these relationships. They can build relationships with the community, with each other, with a view that they can develop as individuals as well, so that they'll start running, you know, the peer-led support groups, and it can really turn into something amazing, that's continuous. You know, not that you just pop back in and out when you feel like it, but come along when things are good, because we want to hear how that's going as well, so it could be an ongoing, continuous thing. And I think peer support and peer-led initiatives have got such great evaluations when we've done them before in the past, and it's great to see how much, you know, people progress in that, and I think that's something we need to tap into more.
Thank you. Julian?
Yeah, just to add on to what Carol said there, I think that peer-to-peer support is really important. And what Carol was alluding to then, that made me start thinking about trauma-informed practice and how actually that peer-to-peer support can nurture a sense of safety, which I think is so important for people who maybe have not experienced safety in their lives, and what it means to be psychologically safe, not only physically safe, but psychologically safe, and to have a group of young people who've had very similar experiences. There's a kinship there. I know in my own experience of the adult adoptee group that we have, it's an unspoken thing that we're all adopted, and actually there's safety in numbers there. And actually, Carol saying another person being paid to ask us our thoughts, it's not the case at all. You know, if we're having a rubbish day, we're just having a rubbish day, you know, and it's about peer-to-peer support is so important because it allows the young people to develop and grow and produce what they think is going to help the next generation of people coming through the system.
That's great, thanks, Julian. And I think, you know, it's worth highlighting that obviously in Adoption UK we see peer support as being one of the foundations for support that everybody should be able to access, you know, from parents to adopted individuals themselves. And Julian's already mentioned the fact that we do have an adult adoptees group, which if anybody wants more information about, please do get in touch. And it's also just to say that we're about to start up, along with some of our other communities parent support groups, we're about to start up one specifically for parents of older teenagers and young adults. So I think that's something which will be a fantastic space for people to come along and share some of the difficult experiences they've had. Carol, the report identifies that support and education can be one of the biggest supportive factors for adoptive families, and I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about the need for support and education and how this can impact.
Yeah, so for this I'll just touch on one experiences, but also some of the stuff that I've noticed within my work as well. So education was the biggest support for me growing up. Just to say that my adoptive family decided not to access any support when they adopted me. They told I had FASD and just went, oh, that's nice, we'll just get on with it, sort of thing. So they knew nothing about, you know, the support that was out there, which is fair enough, but like looking back, they really should have accessed the support because I was a lot to handle. But anyway, so I managed to struggle through school. I had different ways of learning and things like that, and I managed to get the grades to go to university. And my guidance advisor at the time said, you need to go to a traditional university if that's what you want to do. Knowing my background, you know, they knew that I had it, but like I didn't access any support for it. And I shipped myself off to Aberdeen and it failed dramatically. And it had a really big impact on, you know, my own well-being, my mental health. You know, I felt I'd like to let everybody down because I got to a point in life that nobody thought I would have got to. And I just failed, tailed between my legs, hated the world, and went on a bit of a downward spiral. It wasn't until my adoptive dad passed away in 2014 and he asked me to go back into education. He says, look, you've got the life skills, you've got all this experience and that, use it for good, get back into it. So I went back to college, and when I went back to college, what happened was they actually spoke about my background, and coming from a family where you weren't allowed to talk about your background or where you came from or what had happened to you, you were actually asked to share that. You know, it was about, you know, putting support into place, and it led to loads of stuff happening at the college for care experienced students that I got involved with and led on, which is now, just grown arms and legs now for the last 3-4 years, and I'm now studying my masters at the university. So if I didn't come back to college at a later stage and was asked to share my voice and bring a collective voice to the table to support students, I wouldn't be where I was at today. And through all of that, it's led, to the opportunities with, the FASD Hub Scotland, just sharing your voice, and giving so much more people a little bit more inspiration and hope that, an FASD diagnosis isn't the be all and end all, we can achieve, and also that, adoption isn't the end of the line either. Once you're in a placement, the support needs to continue, especially for me, with having FASD. Obviously, I would appear as being maybe, a 37-year-old, which I am, but, emotionally and mentally, I'm a lot younger than what I actually am. So for me, going into adulthood, 25, 26, I was still back as being a teenager, you know what I mean? And that's what I see a lot at the college as well. We have a lot of students that are progressing on, and you have the fear, just like, how are they going to cope without when this support stops? So that's why I'm really passionate that it needs to, that we're recognising this and that it's being noted in the barometer as well.
That's great. Thanks, Carol. Julian, is there anything that you'd like to add about your own personal experience of education?
Yeah, just to really highlight the point that Carol made at the end there, and maybe extend on it around that sort of developmental age and stage, and look at how adopted young people in education, their chronological age might not be their emotional age. For example, in my own experience, I'm 29 and I'm just studying law now. I didn't go to university at the age of 18, and by the time I was 22, I was a lawyer. That's not been my journey nor my story. But the barriers that I had to overcome to get to the point where I am in my educational journey just now was so important, and actually in many ways, that is part of my experience. It's not. We put a lot of emphasis on education, and quite rightly too, but at the same time, success looks different for adopted young people, and there needs to be a recognition within the wider community that is the case.
Thank you. Derek, was education something that your family found tricky for your children, and was there anything that was particularly helpful or not so that was put into place?
I think for both boys, what was good was that the older lad, he had a personal tutor who he absolutely loves and kept trying to say, oh, you can be my adopted dad as well. So he had a really good relationship with him at a personal level, but that wasn't able to translate into a general progress through school and thinking about planning ahead. So it was a positive relationship, but in practical terms, not a very useful relationship. And similarly with the young lad as well, he had a fantastic learning support tutor, and I think things probably would have been a lot worse a lot sooner if he hadn't had that real connection with that learning support tutor to help him manage the problems that he was having at school. And despite that, he had a number of exclusions from school and problems, but again, she was the learning support teacher and wasn't able to fulfill that role of, again, being somebody who could pull things together and provide the support. So I think that's essential, and it's going to be different for different people, finding who that person is. But I think acknowledging that you have to try and find somebody who can be that ally and that advocate for the child while they're at school, and that can be difficult for people. So as I said previously, the system was generally unhelpful. Educational psychology may as well not have been there. So yeah, not very positive experience of school sports, and certainly the exclusions didn't help for the younger. It didn't help us because many of us at home, and school was our kind of relief, because whilst they were at school, we knew we had some respite during the day. So that the exclusions didn't really help. So they needed to find some other way of managing that, and just echoing, I think, what Carol and Julian have said about, having to think about them not being in terms of the chronological age So for both boys, they had some degrees of learning difficulties and social and emotional development stages, and also this thing of having to remind people, yeah, they might be 15, 16, or now nearly 19 and 21. They're still probably more like 13 and 14 in terms of how they relate to other people and how they communicate and how they are able to think through problems.
Thanks, Derek. I mean, that's certainly, from our perspective as a support service, education is one of the biggest things that comes up again and again for families, and it's really important to hear about how the good relationships that can be formed and that understanding of children's needs can make a real difference. Maggie, just from your perspective and working with lots of different families in different environments and areas, is there anything else that you want to add in respect of this being, is this a common issue that you've come across as well, education being a tricky situation?
Yeah, I think it sort of comes up in most studies that we've done in some form or another. And I suppose just thinking about the pilot for the TESA study that Chris and Edward and I have been working on, that education was one of the things that adopters certainly talked about a lot, and it came up in the support that they had from their parent partners, the peer support aspect of it. So I suppose linking back to that discussion about peer support for adopted adults and adopted young people, I think there's a parallel around the support for adoptive parents and how valuable peer support was in lots of different ways. I suppose thinking specifically in relation to education, it's partly about information and having somebody kind of on your side, as it were, when it comes to kind of navigating some of the complexities of some of that. And certainly that, what you were describing there, Derek, I've certainly heard from other adoptive families in other studies, and equally we've heard really good examples of where schools get things right and where they're willing to kind of work with individual children and their families, what a difference that can make in day-to-day life. School's such a massive part of children and young people's lives, isn't it? Just even in terms of the numbers of hours that are spent there. So it feels like a really important area, and in permanently progressing in the first phase, the children were still quite young, but in the second phase, we're going to have sort of more of a focus on some of their experiences in school.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear about that, actually, so I'll be following that with interest. Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for in terms of the questions, but just want to let people know that we are planning to do a bit of a deeper dive with the author's report, Becky Brooks. And I think it's the 25th of August, we've arranged a Wednesday webinar, so hopefully there'll be the opportunity to continue some of these discussions. And I'd just really like to thank everybody who's taken part in the panel today for coming along and sharing your expert input. I'm going to finish off with just showing you the 6 main recommendations for what we believe needs to be put into place to improve experiences for adoptive families in Scotland. I think Ali's got a slide that she's just going to show. But basically, it's very similar to what Becky was speaking about earlier. The fact that we see there as being a need to standardise support from the very beginning, so to create and implement quality standards from the journey of prospective adopters right through. Also that introduction of ring-fence multi-year government funding. In Scotland, there is no national provision of support, which I think has a real impact then, leading to the postcode lottery that was referred to earlier on when we were speaking about your experiences and what you came across in the mapping of adoption support, Maggie. We believe that there should be support plans in place for every child, and again, coming back to people's direct experiences of there being that lack of acknowledgement of need. If that's in place from day one, then the family's got the opportunity to access it, and more importantly, the children have got the opportunity to access it and have that early intervention that might be required to prevent things from escalating to a more crisis level stage later on. All adoption agencies should have a duty to secure and deliver the support identified in the child support plan, or be able to access that externally if it's not appropriate to be delivered by that agency themselves. We believe that there should be training in place for all education and health professionals in early childhood trauma and associated conditions, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and attachment disorder. And I think Ali has put some very helpful links to our FASD Scotland hub and some other peer support groups and other things that we've got going on for anyone that's interested. Our final recommendation is just in respect of that recognition of the real need to hold the family through that transition from child to adult services, with the acknowledgement of the fact that young people might have a different chronological age to their developmental stage, and how that needs to be kept in mind when we're coming to providing support for them to early adulthood. So I'd just like to finish up by giving a few links to the follow-up session with the author, and also to remind people to please follow us on social media and keep up with the events that we've got ongoing on our website page, because that will give you the opportunity to find out what things we've got going on in the near future. We are planning for the next 6 months to go over elements of the report in more detail through a combination of providing resources and doing some additional webinars, as well as the one that we've got with Becky. So I really hope to see many of you there if possible. And thank you all very much for joining us today. If anybody is interested, and those colleagues or peers who weren't able to come along, the session has been recorded and it will be available after use. So I'd just like to finish by thanking our panels again, Julian, Carol, Derek and Maggie. Thank you very much for being here, and Ali for your tech support and doing that so ably. Thanks very much, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.